Hello and welcome to another Try Mechanics podcast. I'm sorry it's been a little while, so we're going to get straight back into things now. And we're going to start to focus on a few of the various topics that I think are quite interesting or quite important as we go into this kind of different time of year, how everything's getting colder, we're going into our kind of off season, and we're starting to think about what kind of things we need to do to set ourselves up ready for next year. So what I thought I'd do today is address a few of the questions that I've had kind of sent through from various people, thinking about a few of those different topics and essentially just trying to answer the best I can, try and provoke a little bit more discussion on them. So I've picked a few topics for today. And the first one I'm going to talk about is about training when you're unwell. So it's always a really hot topic at this time of year. And it's, I think, partly because people are getting sicker now. We're starting to see a lot more people. You've got to think about really why you're getting sick. So the first thing to think about is about kind of acquiring or why we acquire infections. And what we have to really think about is why we're not getting infected. Because actually, we're getting exposed to infections all the time. If you go on a plane or on a bus or a train, it's likely you're going to be exposed to lots of viruses, not only by the people close to you, but also, particularly if you're on a plane, you're going to get exposed to the air that's being recirculated, which means that it's likely that at the most of the time, during any time you're around other people, you're being exposed to various viruses. Now, whether they cause any problems, whether they cause a full-blown infection, all depends on your immune system. And you've got to remember that actually a lot of the symptoms, a lot of the things that you feel when you have a virus are actually your body's reaction and mechanisms to try and fight the thing off. So it's not always caused by the actual virus itself. So we've got to think about, well, if we're getting exposed to these infections, why is it that we sometimes, or why do we get ill at this time of year? And I think it's partly because you're getting exposed to infections that are distinctly different from the ones you're used to, in that you go and see relatives from far away. This is why there was the whole thing, or why there is freshers flu, because it's suddenly a group of people from different parts of the country that come together and are obviously very close at this time of year and spread a lot of those new infections between themselves. Okay, so we're thinking, well, we're getting infected a lot, but actually we're not always displaying symptoms. The reason that's important is because I think sometimes this is why it's important to consider around things like plane travel, that not to train around those times, particularly not to train hard in the day or two after you've travelled, because you may have been exposed to a lot of infections and viruses that are not going to take hold if your body's in good condition. But if you then beat it up again by training, you actually could open the door to let those viruses in. So when thinking about that, we need to think about, well, how do we prevent our body from essentially developing, or how do we allow it to deal with those viruses without even letting us know? And I guess the most important thing is keeping good care of ourselves. So making sure that we're sleeping, making sure we're getting good nutrition. Things like we can think about in terms of micronutrients, things like zinc, we know is really important for the immune system, magnesium and various other things. So we want to make sure that we're getting a good range of vegetables, and that they tend to provide a lot of those nutrients to us, that we're actually, I'm going to go out on a slight limb here, because there is more evidence, or there is significant evidence that actually the micronutrients that are available through certain animal foods are far more available than the plant food types, or those same minerals available in certain plant foods. And it all depends on your microbiome, because what we believe is actually the ability to extract those nutrients, particularly from plants, is a lot dependent on the microbiome, whereas that seems to be significantly less reliant on them when we're getting those things from animal foods. So if you really want to look after your immune system, then having things like liver once a week is really important. Not only to provide a lot of those vitamins, a lot of things like zinc and magnesium and various other minerals, but also things like selenium that are a little bit harder to come by from other sources, but also they're extremely available. So it provides a very available source of iron, which means actually, I remember reading a book by Tim Spector, and he decided that having a mostly plant-based diet, or a plant-rich diet, I think is a probably better way of putting it, is optimal, with a small amount of liver or offal-based meat, red meat, and he got it down to, I think, once a month to maintain good iron and B12 levels. But actually, I think if you're an athlete, it changes the game slightly. I don't think it means you need to consume those foods all the time, but I think you do benefit from consuming them more often. Now, that doesn't mean that going down the vegan line isn't good for you. it's just more reliant on things like your microbiome to able you to break down these things. And there is good evidence that maybe that develops as a result of having more of those foods. But that's a discussion I think we'll leave for another time, because it opens up a big can of worms. But basically, eating well, relaxing, and making sure that you're sleeping well is a really good important part. So what do you actually do when you get ill in terms of training? So I'm going to make a different argument than what you might have heard, because I want people to know that when you train, when you're ill, it is not only pointless, but is only ever going to risk doing you harm. There is never, ever any good that can come from training when you are even slightly ill. The key thing is that you're always going to be debating that. Now, every time I hear people are ill, they are counting down the amount of hours or amount of days they can until they train. They do things like the neck check. I think if anybody ever promotes something like the neck check as a good methodology to decide whether you're going to train when you're ill, they have no idea what they're talking about. Because yes, that virus may be in your nose. It may, those symptoms you might be getting it from, it might be in your sinuses. But if you go out and breathe really hard, or even, when you're swimming, having to breathe relatively hard, you're going to suck all those things down into your chest. Now, you may or may not get a pneumonia as a result of that. It's not a guarantee, that's for sure. But it's not going to help things. So doing the neck check and deciding that you can still go out and train is a really poor way of looking at it. The best way, I think, to look at it is think about, well, what benefit are you actually going to get? Apart from maybe getting out in the fresh air a little bit, that could probably help, but you could get that through a nice walk. You are going to gain nothing. The reason you're going to gain nothing is a very simple way of explaining it. When you train, in order to achieve something, you have to essentially create a little bit of cell chaos. There has to be a pressure on the cell, whether you produce enough energy or whatever along those lines, in order to overload and improve. Then essentially that's what you're going for. Now, obviously, there's the elements of biomechanics and skill and various other elements that are part of the training modalities. But predominantly, when you're overloading, you are trying to create that little bit of chaos. Now, you're not going to be able to create any of that chaos in the slightest if you are ill. And if you do create the chaos, if you manage to push yourself to the point where you can create that chaos, you are in a very bad situation indeed. The second argument is things like post-viral syndromes. So we don't really understand things like post-viral syndromes and ME and these kind of chronic fatigue syndromes that can develop, but often they are related to having an illness, a virus. And we know that things like diabetes can actually stem, type 1 diabetes I'm talking about, that could happen when you're younger, throughout your life, but is more common when you're younger, can stem from having a virus that then means that your immune system seems to go into overdrive. Well, that can happen as a result of training, and this is what post-viral syndrome might be related to. It seems to be related to things like stressful situations when you have that virus. But it could also be related to exercising intensively during that period, because what you then could be doing is overstressing that immune system. That means it has too many battles to fight. It's trying to control the virus, but also at the same time, it's trying to repair the damage that exercise does. Because you've got to remember that exercise is damaging. It is a hormetic stress. It is a stress on the body. It is a stress that is designed to create a little bit of havoc, but not too much. It's designed to create it in a way that you can then repair, recover, and get stronger, which is exactly why exercise can often be the best medicine, because actually across the board, across the cells, everything, it has such a profound effect. So that is my argument for not training at all. And I am firmly on the belief that when you are ill, you do not train, you relax, you recover, you sleep, you eat well, you try and just recover your body as much, you try and let it do what it needs to do, and then you wait at least a few days when all the symptoms have gone, and then you get back into training. And yes, those first few sessions might be tough, particularly if you've had a week or two off, but trust me, not only are you reducing your risk, doesn't mean you're completely eliminating it, but you're reducing your risk of that post-viral syndrome. But the key thing from that is that actually you're not going to do any good, so what's the point? What's the point in risking it? And actually, you will feel much better and stronger as a result. And the only thing you can really do, like many injuries, is give it time. Injuries can often respond to various training stimulus in terms of trying to repair them. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing that helps an injury is giving it the time and just the right amount of movement. And it's the same as when you're ill. essentially all you just need is to give your body time. It's doing its job. You don't need to throw a load of pills in. You don't need antibiotics unless it's a full-blown bacterial infection. Even then, you may not need antibiotics because your body is doing the work. Sometimes antibiotics can help when it's struggling a little bit in certain situations. Okay, so that's that topic kind of put to one side for now. If you've got any more questions related to that, then be sure to kind of fire them across. But I hope there really isn't any questions, because I believe that if you are going to be asking questions, can I do this, can I do that, then you're starting to really kind of bargain with what your body wants to do. If you want to do a bit of maybe body weight, yoga, things like that, fantastic. But beyond that, I think you're probably not really going to be doing much good at all. Even things like weightlifting might even cause problems. So we're going to go off on a slightly different tangent, because I want to talk a little bit about polarized training and threshold training. The reason I want to talk about these is because it gets brought up every single time or every single year around this time, is people are starting to look at what kind of structured training they should do, particularly over the winter, to prepare themselves for the race season. And they get their head turned by various different modalities, whether it's, as I say, threshold or sweet spot training, whether it's polarized training. It's become seemingly the new kind of panacea. And I've gone on about this a long time in regards to particularly cycling, that I don't think polarised training is all it's cracked up to be. And I think that's partly due to the fact that, despite the fact that there has been the odd study that seemed to look at polarised training with a limited amount of hours, I don't think it was particularly well conducted. And actually, I still don't believe that the optimal way of training, if you have limited hours, is polarised training. The simple reason is because particularly on the bike, when you're doing the low end of polarised training, i.e. the nice, easy stuff, the evidence is actually supportive that the effect you get from this is only when you've been riding or training for long enough to start to fatigue the slow twitch muscle fibres. It's also related to upregulation of things like MCT transporters that transport lactate from essentially they transport it out of the lactate producing fibres, the kind of fast twitch fibres, into the slow twitch fibres to be used as a fuel. And those tend to be, the evidence that suggests that those are, or that's beneficial from long, easy training, is the long element. It does seem to be that it takes a few hours to really get into that. And the other thing is things like lower energy status. So as you've been out for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours, your energy in the cell is going down whether you've taken in food or not. And that is starting to send a stimulus or a positive stimulus that seems to have a benefit. So that's the kind of critical thing, really, is that actually a lot of the benefits you get from the lower end of polarised training are after a significant amount of time. So yes, if you have got 4 to 5 hours to ride, you can get some benefit from it. But if you haven't, then you're not going to really get much good from doing the same intensity but for 1 or 2 hours. This is where you have to start thinking about the polarised model as a model to try and avoid being right at that point of threshold. And this is where it gets mixed up with sweet spot model. Because the thing about sweet spot is that most people's sweet spot probably isn't a defined percentage of FTP, particularly as it changes day on day. So if you've ever come across sweet spot training regards to the bike, it's really about training at it was designed to be about 90%, or supposedly the literature suggests that most people are around 90% of functional threshold, which is for most people around an hour of effort. It's actually not defined at that hour, but we're going to leave it at that for now because it gets a little bit cloudy. But basically it's around that for most people, and about 90% often is the sweet spot for people to be able to train this intensity relatively regularly. In fact, actually the proponents of it seem to want to do it 4 or 5 times or maybe up to 6 times a week. Now, the idea with sweet spot is not the training intensity, it's the recovery from that intensity, and the idea that you should be able to do around an hour at that intensity and still recover and be able to do it again the next day. And you could see how clearly that is actually quite different, and maybe even changes day on day. If you were to do it one day and on another day you're very fatigued, then it might go down to 85%. So that's the critical thing, is most people end up doing sweet spot training incorrectly because they're actually doing it higher than they are able to do, because that isn't their sweet spot. In some cases that is. Some people have a very high capacity to recover, particularly if you're young. But I think as you get older, particularly, your sweet spot may end up going down. And I think that has to bear in mind that it's definitely not a defined percentage. The whole idea behind sweet spot training really was that you were getting up close to the kind of this aerobic stimulus or the kind of, as you went more intense on the training, you got higher and higher aerobic stimulus. So you were trying to get up to a certain amount that had a good stimulus, but wasn't too much of an overload. That means you can still recover. And I believe that if you stick with that, you can actually accomplish that training almost every day. And it builds a big aerobic engine. Because when you think about the polarized training, going back to this, because the two models are intricately linked. They might often appear that they're not, but actually, particularly for the time-pressed athlete, they are. Because the lower end of essentially polarized training, if you imagine in your head that you are looking at three kind of bars or a chart of intensity with essentially two lines that breaks up into three zones. Now, the middle zone we're going to mark as between LT or kind of lactate threshold or lactate turn point 1 and lactate turn point or threshold 2. Threshold 2 tends to be around that 40-50 minutes up to kind of around FTP, and LT1 tends to be around that point where the kind of ventilatory threshold, or you're starting to breathe a little harder, or it's just often just below that, but it's around that kind of area. Now, race pace for anything from 10 miles to maybe 10 miles is probably maybe on that border of just above that, maybe that kind of LT2, but mostly around 25 miles an hour to up to 2 hours is around in that middle zone, basically. And the idea is that you should avoid that zone, and that by being below LT1 you can do more volume and accumulate these efforts essentially below that LT1 to produce a little bit of lactate and essentially work on those MCT transporters that kind of re-shuttle lactate around. And then you also get to work on all the aerobic side of things, but you don't really develop any fatigue, and then you push up that LT1, and that pushing up that LT1 is a very good thing if you're a cyclist. It's a very good thing if you're going to be cycling in packs. It means you're going to be accumulating very little lactate when you're at those kind of intensities within the group. And then you want to be doing a little bit of training above that kind of LT2. So that's the other end of the polarized training, that hard work there, not ridiculously hard, but hard work stimulates the aerobic, the top end of the aerobic system, stimulates the kind of VO2 max, the delivery systems and various other, that side of things, and the enzymes and various other processes in the cell that require a bit of high intensity. But you must avoid the bit in the middle. Now, that bit in the middle for a highly trained cyclist might actually be only about 40-50 watts, if that. It might just be that section in the middle that is around their FTP. And actually, LT1, their VT, around their ventilator threshold, can sometimes only be maybe 80% of their FTP, which is actually 80 to 85%. So actually almost going into that bottom end of the sweet spot. And that's the critical thing, is that's why real sweet spot is not really far much above that, and I don't think causes a lot of problems. I don't believe it's this black hole that we've kind of led to believe by some coaches and some proponents of the threshold model. But I believe that if you do a lot of stuff around threshold, yes, you're probably going to be knacking yourself out, because you're going to be in that pushing quite hard. You are going to be creating an aerobic stimulus, but also you're going to have to recover well and you're probably not going to achieve the same volume of that would actually do more good. So it's better to drop the intensity down a little bit, round into that tempo zone and gain more volume. So those are kind of a few of my thoughts about that, kind of thinking about the polarized and threshold models. They're not too different. The whole point being is that, yes, if you've got hours and hours and hours to train and you can go out for a consecutive 4 or 5 hours, then yeah, take it nice and easy, because the kind of benefits you'll get from the end are really positive. But if you only have an hour, 2 hours at most here and there, then pushing up that intensity a little bit, as long as it's within reason, it's not going to do you too much harm. If you're going to do the polarized training and you're going to be only training for an hour or two, you can push up towards that point where you're still below LT1. So you're still breathing easily. So you don't have to dawdle. You don't have to go really slowly. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of people make, is they end up doing those hour, 2 hour sessions very, very easily and actually then don't achieve the benefits, because there are supposedly benefits. There's a lot of people that believe that the polarized training is all about the top end, and it really isn't. Because you're not just doing the bottom end to set you up for the top end. The bottom end has its own benefits too. So if you can get that done the right way, you can not only still set yourself up for the top end by having that big aerobic base, that means that you can achieve that icing on the cake, but also you get some of the actual real benefits that you get from the lower end. So I'm going to leave those topics for now. I've talked a little bit more about those than I wanted to, so I'm going to leave the end of the podcast for now, and we're going to address a couple of the other things that I was thinking about, all the other questions, in the next podcast in a few days' time. Thank you very much for listening. As again, this podcast is essentially brought to you by Try Mechanics. We offer running analysis, movement, and all looking at basically how your life integrates with the way that you run. We also offer triathlon coaching. So we've got one spot hopefully coming up available in the next month or so, particularly for races for next year. We offer a very different style of coaching. It's very integrative. It's very focused on you, not really focused around things like training plans. It's more about how the rest of your life and how these things can build you to become the best athlete that you can be by being essentially the healthiest person to start off with. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful, and goodbye.